This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. Dr. Barbara Perry is the director of the Centre on Hate, Bias and Extremism at Ontario Tech University in Oshawa. On September the 16th, she talked to our first Defence and Security Studies virtual evening of the fall 2021 season. Her theme was right-wing extremism, implications for the Canadian Armed Forces.
Thank you, Sylvia. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Royal Canadian Military Institute Defense and Security Studies Program speaker event for September. My name is Dr. Daniel Eustace, and I'm the director of the Defense and Security Studies Program, and it's my pleasure to be the moderator for this evening's presentation by Dr. Barbara Perry, who is the director of the Centre on Hate, Bias and Extremism at Ontario Tech University. This is another one of those interesting subjects and important subjects that the RCMI has been tackling over the last several months. We've obviously seen in the United States and certainly within Canada some examples of terroristic type actions, call them what you will, that have been categorized as right-wing extremism. And this is obviously not only significant to the Canadian population as a whole and to the government, but also has implications for the Canadian Armed Forces, from whom and with whom these incidents have been associated. So I think it's the sort of thing that we need to be more fully informed about. And we're extremely fortunate tonight to have been able to convince Dr. Barbara Perry to come and speak to us for a while. As I mentioned, she is with the Ontario Tech University. She's a professor, the director of the Centre on Hate, Bias and Extremism in the Faculty of Social Science and Humanities. She's written extensively on this subject, and she's the general editor of a 5-volume set on hate crime and editor of Volume 3, The Hate Crime, which is part of that set. She's written extensively on policing diverse communities, including work on social control in Native communities, and she has made substantial contributions to limited scholarship on hate crime in Canada. And she's also contributed to a scholarly understanding of anti-Muslim violence and hate crime against these communities and the community impacts of hate crime and right-wing extremism. So Barbara is in fact really the leading expert, I would suggest, in this subject in Canada. She holds a doctorate in sociology from Carleton University. And at the end of the presentation tonight, we will have an opportunity to do questions and answers. And you can use your Q&A function or the chat function to ask questions. And we'll do our best to get to all of those questions in whatever order they appear. So I'm going to, with that, turn it over now to Barbara and welcome her remotely to the RCMI, hopefully physically to the RCMI very, very soon as we start to transition and being more open to guests. So it's a great pleasure that I ask Barbara Perry to take over at this point in time. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you, Dan. Very kind words. I really appreciate that. And yeah, I hope that I can come down and visit in person at some point and learn from you as well. I think there's certainly plenty that you can share with me, I'm sure, in this particular field. As I know that many elements, many pieces associated with the DND and the military broadly are really starting to pay attention to this. It's really been something, I think, for the last maybe 2 or 3 years that has come to the fore. It was probably about 3 years ago that we started having conversations with the CDS, who had reached out to us. That is my colleague David Hoffman and I, about what we were seeing on the ground around right-wing extremism, what we knew. And there wasn't much we could tell them at that point in time. No one has really been looking at this very closely. So the work that we're doing is among the first in Canada to take a deep dive into this issue. I've just got a PowerPoint presentation here I'm going to share now and work our way through that. You see here, I've got sort of 2 logos on my presentation, the Centre on Hate, Bias and Extremism that we launched about 3 years ago now in 2018. But also we are about 1.5 years into this network, which was funded by the Minds program from DND. So before I proceed, I just want to tell you a little bit about the network. And it's a very long title rather, the Network for Research into Right-Wing Extremism in the CAF. I think it's the longest title of all of the, I think we've got now 13 or 14 networks in the family. So it is what it says on the tin. This is exactly what we are doing. We are really a research network rather than just a knowledge dissemination. We have to build the knowledge before we can disseminate. And this is the team that we've built up to date, sort of the core of the team. We've got some other people that we engage with, but myself and Dr. David Hoffman at UNB are the leads, and we have a postdoc fellow as well, Dr. Phil McChrystal, who recently, just last fall, a year ago now, received his PhD from Queen's, but he also is a former military personnel, so he's been very insightful in this. And then you can see the other team members really across the country. So the network is to start a 3-year network, and our intent is really to engage in a whole array of different kinds of research projects, which will get us a little bit further down the road to understanding the depth, the breadth, the extent of sort of the infiltration of the far right in the CAF. And so, we're hoping to provide this sort of independent assessment and evaluation of what we find through interviews, through surveys, through public access, et cetera. Whatever means we can to get at this. Social media as well. There's a lot of activities on social media that points to some of these issues. And so we are also very much engaged. In fact, every couple of months or so, we host a webinar exploring different issues. The first couple that we presented were really about the network itself and what we were doing and what our intent was, what our goals were, our aims. And now we're starting to provide more substantive ones, largely by inviting colleagues from across the globe who actually have been doing research in this area ahead of us. We don't have much expertise in the Canadian context to call on. But we're glad to keep you apprised of that. And you can look on our website, both for the Center on Hate, Bias, and Extremism and for the network to get information on those webinars. Excuse me. I just want to start here with sort of, I guess, situating the field, what it is we're talking about, who it is we're talking about when we talk about right-wing extremism. So we are in the midst of another project, and a separate project from that, funded by Public Safety Canada, where we are doing an updated study, what we call an environmental scan of right-wing extremism in Canada. My colleague Ryan Scrivens and I completed the first study published the first study in 2015. And at that time, it was the first, again, the very first comprehensive examination of the movement in the Canadian context. And at that time, this is really what we were focusing on, really what we were seeing, in fact, in Canada, were quite traditional elements of the right-wing extremist movement, neo-Nazis, skinheads, white supremacists. Not a lot distinguishing them aside from uniforms, aside from the level of aggression and violence. The skinheads, racist skinheads, I should say, being probably the most aggressive and the most violent of the bunch. But they were tied together by the foundations of white supremacy, anti-Semitism, and valorization of neo-Nazi ideals, or Nazi ideals, I suppose we should say. Since then, and in the current project, the update on that, we've really sort of exploded this notion of what this typology, I guess, this notion of what the far right looks like now, because there have been really significant quantitative and qualitative shifts in the movement. So we're seeing, many more pieces come to the fore. The lone actors and anti-authority piece, we were sort of, we were attending to last time around. It's really the ones on this side that are new and very discrete. There are common threads, things that bind all of these groups together, especially, the notion of nationalism in defense of the nation, sort of an extreme and corrupted notion of patriotism. Which is, I think, one of the reasons why they find the military to be appealing, because they think they share the values. But again, it's a corruption of patriotism as reflected in so many of these elements. I'm not going to define them all. We can at the end. I can come back and explain what each of them are. But I think the ones that we've seen very active within the military, both in Canada and the US, is the accelerationist movement. And is, again, it is what it says on the tin, right? Accelerationist. The intent, again, neo-nationalists intent on establishing a white ethno-state, but they're also intent on provoking a civil war that will allow them to rebuild that white ethno-state. And it could be, you know, the very traditional, what used to be associated with the skinheads and neo-Nazis in particular, RAHOA, the racial holy war, or it can be, you know, an all-out civil war. And so they were celebrating. I mean, they were actors, but they were also celebrating the events of January 6th in the US because they saw that as the beginning of that civil war. And I think they're calling for the sort of furthering that momentum on, I think it's September 21st, the day after our election, where there is, you know, planned rallies and marches on Washington, D.C. in celebration of the events of January 6th. So we need to watch that very carefully. But of course, there were a lot of accelerationists involved in January 6th, but even on the Canadian side. So these are groups like the Base, and Adam Waffen, for example, and these are groups that are active in Canada and that are actively recruiting, attempting to recruit in this or from the CAF. So I think that's one of the groups that we really need to be aware of. You see that I've got conspiracy theorists and anti-authority here in italics, primarily because they're not, you know, all anti-authority or anti-statists and all conspiracy theorists are not necessarily right-wing. They run the continuum from left to right, and in fact, apolitical as well. But there is a large contingent of both of these that are very much to the right, often also embedded in racist ideology. So if you think about some of the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories around COVID-19, for example, those are the folks that we're placing in the sort of right-wing movement there. So again, we can come back to some of these later if you want some clarification. Distribution of the far right. This is the map out of 2015. That first study, the numbers have changed, but the distribution is very similar. Ontario, Quebec, and especially Alberta continue to be the real hotbeds for the far right, and especially sort of Western Ontario. You know, Toronto, down that sort of 401 corridor from Toronto to and west down the 401. And so the distribution is the same, the number is much greater. So this represented just over 100 active groups. Again, probably a very conservative estimate then. It was just the two of us on about $40,000. So, you know, a real challenge. Over the last couple of years, we've identified closer to, and perhaps even now tipping over 300 active groups in Canada across all of those elements that we saw here in that typology. And then we're also seeing a number of sort of floaters, if you will, a number of law enforcement and intelligence officers in particular have talked about sort of an atomization of the movement. That is, you know, more and more individuals coming to the movement, engaging online, some actually quite passively very often, but sometimes actively, but consuming, you know, sort of the online narratives associated with some of these far right groups without necessarily affiliating with any particular one. So really difficult to count them. You know, they're likely in the thousands, but again, that's not much more than a guess. So in addition to these organized groups that are in cells from, you know, 3, 4, or 6 people up to, you know, groups like Lamut, for example, claims to have tens of thousands of online members anyway. So, you know, we're talking about increased numbers collectively, but also individually. When for that first study, we identified over 120 incidents associated with incidents of violence associated with far-right extremists in the Canadian context between 1980 and 2015. We're continuing to sort of accumulate cases since then, of course, since 2015. But just during that same period of time, just think for a minute, okay, 120 incidents of right-wing extremist violence. Surely there must be more Islamist-inspired violence because we especially then we're paying so much more attention to that particular threat. But in fact, we identified about 8 incidents of Islamist-inspired extremism during the same period of time. So these ranged from, going back here, now these ranged from assaults on the street to uttering threats, those sorts of things, but all the way up to arsons and, in fact, homicides. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the homicides we've seen over the past few years. So what I've represented here are really just the mass murders associated with right-wing extremists. So beginning in 2014, where 3 RCMP officers were killed by an individual informed by right-wing anti-authority sentiments and narratives. 2017, of course, where 6 Muslim men were murdered in the mosque. 2018, 10 people killed, in the mosque, motivated by Islamophobia, xenophobia, anti-immigrant sentiment, very much right-wing narratives. And then in 2018, of course, 10 people killed in the van attack in downtown Toronto by an individual that was connected to the incel movement, so that misogynistic arm, if you will, of the far right. And then most recently, the 4 family members in London, Ontario, Muslim family members who were murdered, again, by someone very much like the murderer in Quebec City. And then we've had 2 or 3 additional individual murders. Now, the interesting thing about each of these is, going back to that notion of atomization and lone actors, each of these were lone actors in the sense that they acted on their own. They were not formally affiliated with any particular group, but they were very much animated by and motivated by their engagement, their consumption of the online narratives that they were taking from the far right websites and other social media platforms. So we're observing, pardon me, in this updated study, as I mentioned, a number of significant quantitative and qualitative trends. So, I talked about the growth in numbers. Yeah, absolutely. We've seen a trebling, at least, the number of active groups across Canada. And that includes new chapters of existing groups. So groups like we were talking earlier on about the National Socialist Party, and that has grown and introduced new chapters across the country as well. But we've also seen a lot of new groups emerge since 2015. Groups like the Proud Boys, even, who ironically, were founded by a Canadian expatriate in the U.S. Pegida, which is an acronym from the German for Patriotic Europeans Against the Islamization of the West. So you can see how that's connected to that one bit on the typology, the anti-Muslim element of the movement. So yeah, new chapters and new groups as well are accounting for that growth in absolute numbers that we've seen. One of the other interesting things that we're noting is a demographic shift. So again, when you think back to what was sort of the kinds of groups that were most active that are referred to in the typology, the skinheads, the neo-Nazis, and the white supremacists, especially the skinheads and the neo-Nazis. What do you picture in your head when you think of them? It's a youth movement primarily. So, there might be some in leadership positions that have stayed on for several years and, are into their 30s, maybe even into middle age. But for the most part, those traditional elements have been youth. 16 or 18 to 24, 26, 28, somewhere around there. Excuse me. We're seeing a much older demographic now, and we began to see that, I think, with the rise of the yellow vests in out west in particular. Now, the yellow vest is an interesting example there. This was a movement that originated around a set of really legitimate concerns about threats to the energy sector and to the oil industry in particular in the context of Alberta. But it was very quickly co-opted by explicitly and quite obviously co-opted by elements of the far right who tried to graft on their xenophobic and anti-immigrant sentiments, anti-globalization sentiments onto the yellow vests. And so, we're scapegoating racialized communities and immigrants, blaming the dip in the economic challenges in the West on immigration and globalization, those sorts of things. And we're quite effective at doing that, which I think is probably one of the reasons why Yellow Vest actually didn't survive. And a lot of people walked away from that because that was not what they had signed up for. But nonetheless, the Yellow Vest was an older demographic, and sort of middle age and older. So there, with groups like Pegida, a lot of the activists that we're seeing currently in some of the protests we're seeing across the country are middle age and older. Right, so it's no longer just a youth movement. They're still there. It's been supplemented now by an older demographic. We're also seeing a demographic that is better educated and often not just employed, but well employed. Again, we think about the skinheads, for example, the neo-Nazis as chronically unemployed, as disenfranchised and disenchanted, and unable and ignorant and uneducated and unable to get a good job. But in fact, we're seeing a very different dynamic again. We only need to look at January 6th, the events there and the individuals involved there, where we had military and law enforcement personnel involved in the insurrection, but also doctors and lawyers and accountants and other professionals. If we look at the alt-right element of the movement, if you think back to especially the early days, Richard Spencer, for example, these are people with often university degrees, white-collar jobs, middle-class jobs, professional jobs, who lend some palatability and credibility and professionalization to the far right movement because of their much more professional presentation of self. So not just in those, black jackets, and as you see here with some of the other groups, their black sweatshirts and hoodies, but in, coming in their business suits, or as the case with Proud Boys, in their, what were they, Izod shirts or something, Ralph Lauren shirts, whatever they were. So again, it's very much like, David Duke in the 80s, right, who was the grand wizard of the KKK, who said, throw off the white hoods and put on your business suits. This is the way that we will attract, more members. And we're seeing, a different kind of presentation of self here. So again, a very significant demographic shift in the far right movement in Canada. We're also seeing much more coalition building. When we were doing the study in 2012, 13, 14, there was a lot of infighting within groups, but also across groups. So they were jockeying for position, who was the most extreme, or, who was the most patriotic, or, the most willing to engage in violence to defend themselves and the nation, however they defined it, however narrowly they defined it. Now, and I'm sure you're very much aware of this, you've seen it in the rallies that we saw, especially in 2017, 2018. But what we see here indicated there's incredible coalition building across groups. So they're strategizing largely online to engage in online and offline behavior that is a show of strength and solidarity. So that, they're sort of showing themselves, proving to themselves, but also to the broader audience that might be observing them, that they are a cohesive movement. I think it's a little bit of an exaggeration. They're still not that well organized, but we're seeing it again, and we're seeing again the co-optation of populist concerns and anxieties around COVID, and the far right using that and building a new coalition around, the anti-lockdown movement, and around the anti-mask movement, all of those pieces, the anti-Trudeau protests that we're seeing along the campaign trail. So again, exploiting those anxieties and trying to graft their own agenda onto that. So another form of coalition building. The last trend that we're seeing, and we're just beginning to see that at the end of our first study, is this growing fascination with arms and heavy arms and with paramilitary training. So we first saw it, of course, in militia groups like the 3 Percenters, but now it's spread across the movement. So the Proud Boys, even one of their mantras is, "We love our guns." And so you see images of some of these groups with stockpiles of weapons. You see them out in the woods engaging in, paramilitary training, all of those pieces. So very dangerous, I think, because you've got the arms and now the training as well. And this is what we're looking at is the extent to which this is the case. If you're drawing on military and law enforcement personnel, whether current or former, you've now got that training. So arms training, and then the xenophobic ideologies, right? The whatever it is, anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, and anti-state, very often, ironically, positioning of them. So very dangerous combination there. Cause for concern. Why do we worry about this from the perspective of the CAF? Well, first, the groups themselves have claimed membership, and individuals have claimed that they are active or former military personnel. So, for example, Lamut, which is a Quebec-based group, which was founded actually by 2 former military personnel, claims to have at least 75 members who are currently military personnel. So again, that's the claim from their perspective. We know that groups are actively recruiting from the military. They're very explicit about it on their websites very often, or their social media platforms. We saw that with Patrick Matthews, obviously in 2019. We're also seeing sort of the other side of that, and that is encouraging current members of the movement or of their groups to enlist, to seek military training, typically in the reserve, but sometimes in regular forces as well. Again, so they get what they think is the training they need: tactical training, leadership training, all of those pieces they can bring back to the movement to help them better plan and better train their membership. We have the military police report from 2018, which identified 53, which we think is the tip of the iceberg, 53 members that were associated in some way with hate groups or hate crime, what we're now calling hateful conduct in the military. So we've got that as a sort of a starting point, if you will, for investigation. And then we've got this series of really high profile cases. And again, many of these are ones that have been outed by media or by other monitoring agencies, rather than folks who were sort of made public by the military. And you can see here, just a handful of examples and their affiliation with particular groups or movements, parts of the movement. So we do have, and many of these were reservists. Some were regular, but many were reservists. And I think that that's an interesting distinction, and something we will be looking at very closely. And I think the last, not the only, but the last point I'll raise is that there's some evidence from research in the US, for example, and in Germany as well, that the presence of military members within the movement enhances the likelihood of violence. And so, the few studies that have been done in the US and a few more studies in Germany have found, in fact, that there is something, something about that background, that history that contributes to not just that individual engaging in violence, but collective violence on the part of groups of which they are a part. So, that's obviously very worrying in general. So there are a whole array. I'm just about out of time, so I'll go quickly through this. Public Safety Canada presented this sort of list of factors that are particularly important when we think about how and why people are vulnerable to recruitment. And I think we can think about most of those in the context of the military as well. That they are engaging in social networks offline and online. And that I think also points to the, sort of the, especially for the bases that are in rural areas, what's the environment there, right? That actually allows that. So we've seen a lot of activity in Manitoba, for example, for some reason. Is there something in the communities around the bases there that's seeping into the military and drawing people into the movement? So we need to look at the social networks that people are developing online and offline. We need to look at the grievances that members might be carrying with them, whether it's because of experiences in active duty or dissatisfaction with their role in the military, or whatever the case may be. There are a set of grievances that can be amplified by the movement and exploited as a way of bringing people in. Vulnerabilities in terms of mental health issues, in terms of substance abuse issues, those are the kinds of vulnerabilities we're talking about there, things that sort of weaken people's resolve, if you will, and make them a little more malleable from a recruitment perspective. Looking for a sense of belonging and status seeking. These are especially important in the context of veterans, which we haven't really talked about yet, but really important consideration is the extent to which veterans are looking for the reproduction of that status and that camaraderie that they had when they were serving. And sometimes the far right movement can provide exactly that kind of context for them. And then, of course, the inclination towards violence. You've been trained to engage in violence, and are you looking for an outlet for that aside from your military engagement in the broader population? So these are things that we can look at in terms of how people with military experience, again, whether it's current or former, can be exploited by the far right in terms of recruitment. The last, I think this is my last slide here, as we're really looking at multiple points of engagement. Pardon the phone in the back, the joys of presenting from home. That there are multiple points at which people are vulnerable in different ways. So we're looking at engagement prior to service. That is those folks I mentioned earlier on who are encouraged to come into the military to gain that training and then go away. So they come into to the CAF with membership in the far right. Engagement during service. How are they recruited? Are they recruited? Do they go looking because of experience that they might have had, overseas or in active combat? So that's an area to examine. And then the last one is engagement after service. That is the extent to which people are veterans in particular, are actively recruited, again, because of the recognition of the skills that they can bring to the movement. And I referred to this notion of veterans needing a place, looking for a place to reproduce that lifestyle, that discipline, that brotherhood, pardon the gendered term, that they had in the military, and that can be found very often, all too often, in the far right movement as well. So these are all the levels at which we are looking. And ultimately, our intent is to help to define, for areas for policy development in terms of training, in terms of screening, not just at entry, but an ongoing basis, ways to respond to people once they've been identified. Are there opportunities? Are there ways? Is there any opportunity for rehabilitation, or must it just be a punitive approach? That seems counterproductive. It can further embitter and harden the resolve of people. Transition support, not just from into post-military life, but also transition support when coming back from active duty. And again, I think I can't stress enough the importance of the work that Veterans Affairs might be able to do with the support of CAF, and sort of easing that transition out and providing preventative mechanisms at that point of disengagement from the military. So I will stop there and stop sharing as well. And hopefully we do have some time. Yes, we do. Time for questions, and happy to answer anything that you have.
Thanks, Barbara. That was extremely interesting. I don't know really to what extent our viewers or people in general really understand the extent of what has gone on and what is going on. It's pretty shocking in some respects. Let me start off with some questions from our participants, and I'll take them in order. So Diane Maddox asks a question: Are you preparing a report specifically for the CAF, and have indicated the right-wing extremist support will be helping to identify issues within the ranks? And how would you explain how you're determining the personal views of many individuals or specific demographics currently serving within the CAF? Are you requesting volunteers to complete a survey to ensure a quantifiable result, or is your reporting predominantly subjective? I think that's a great question.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dan.
Yeah, it's both. It is a really great question. It is a multi-method approach that we have. So our first, we're already engaging in the open source analysis, looking at media reports and pulling from that. But the first sort of in the field work that we'll be doing, we're starting with interviews from across the board, really. That is, base command, folks at D&D HQ. We'll talk to padres, social workers. We'll talk to people at different levels throughout. Not so much frontline at this point. So what we're really doing with the interviews is getting to people's observations. What are they aware of happening around them? The survey will be the next piece, and it's going to be the much trickier piece. And that's where we will be getting more to whatever extent we can. And this is going to be a real challenge, self-reporting. And not about attitudes so much as engagement in hateful conduct, engagement with these groups, engagement with their social media posts. So it's about self-reporting, as well as because this will go more broadly. This will go to frontline. It's not just for sort of lead or command. So again, the surveys will look at self-report, but also what others are seeing amongst their peers, for example. So both that qualitative perspective and the quantitative perspective as well.
Okay, great. Let me ask you another question. I'm just going to riff a little bit off of something that David Beer's asking you, but also I committed to one of our guests, Dr. Joseph DeClaro, who's actually one of my students. Canadian Forces Colleges here. He's from the United States, and he's going to be writing a paper on right-wing extremism. And one of the things that he's interested in is, the extent to, and this is similar to David Beer's question, for the extent to which the United States has been an influence, significant or otherwise, on what has been happening in terms of the growth of right-wing extremism in Canada. I think historically we've kind of known that there have been Canadian groups around for a long time, but there does seem to be a rather recent uptick. And I understand your research is early, but what's your sense at the moment? Do you think there's a degree of influence coming from the United States on this issue?
Well, I think at the broader level, not, it's hard to say within the CAF, but I think at the broader social level, we're definitely influenced by patterns in the US. So it's no coincidence, I think, that we started to see the uptick in right-wing extremism after the 2016 election, after Trump was elected. And we saw those, anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, anti-Latino, anti-Black, anti-trans, anti-gay narratives that really circulated quite freely in the US. And of course, we were influenced by that as well. And so while we saw an uptick in right-wing extremism in the US, we also saw that in the Canadian context as well. There was fertile soil here. We like to think that we're very different than the US and that we're not vulnerable to that. But in fact, public opinion polling had been showing for, at least a decade prior to that, prior to 2016, sizable proportions, 25% of the population, 20% of the population, expressing very negative sentiments in public opinion polling to Muslims, Islam, immigration, LGBTQ, rights issues generally. So I think that there was fertile soil for that kind of narrative. There was also, sort of a very explicit attempt on the part of American groups to recreate themselves in the Canadian context. And so they've been actively recruiting here, recruiting recruiters, essentially training the trainers, like we saw with Patrick Matthews, right, who was meant to be, a lead Canadian recruiter. We see that in the broader context as well. Somehow bringing in Canadians or even sometimes exporting their own members to come and try to organize in the Canadian context. So yeah, very much. And of course, the social media platforms are open to anyone. So if you look on Stormfront, for example, Canadian individuals and groups are engaging very much. Stormfront being the oldest and largest far-right social media forum.
Okay. Well, then let me pick up on that, because Dave was also interested in a couple other questions, and I think they're both important. Is there a particular group within Canada that sort of sees itself as the leader, either in terms of the numbers or just their position within the right wing agglomeration? And at the same time, if you wouldn't mind commenting on what you think has been happening recently with some of the demonstrations in the election, which seems to be entirely out of character with our normal election scenarios. Do you think any of this is attributable to some of this right-wing activity?
Yeah. Okay. So the first question is about dominant groups, and I think that's really fluid. So, for the last 2 years, I think the Proud Boys really came to the fore. And of course, after they were designated a terrorist entity, they actually, I wouldn't say they disappeared, I would say they've rebranded. So they've reappeared in a different guise, but they were very dominant for a good couple of years, again really taking their cue from the American scene prior to that. So over probably 2016, 2017, Soldiers of Odin was very visible in virtually every community across Canada, large and medium-sized communities, as Proud Boys was until 8 months ago, evident in pretty much every city across Canada. So those are the ones in recent years that have been, I think, largest and the largest number of chapters. But I think, if you want to think about it in qualitative terms, I think the ones that are most worrying are probably the base in Atomwaffen, and then groups like the 3 Percenters, the militia groups, or the patriot groups, in part because these are the most aggressive in terms of their language. And the accelerationists, like the base in Atomwaffen in particular, are also the most likely to both promote and engage in violence. So those are, qualitatively, I think those are the ones that I worry about the most. And the second was about the movements that we're seeing now. I've talked so much about this week. I've done a series of interviews on exactly this. And I think we've got, again, this loose coalition coming together. So the anti-Trudeau sentiment has been there almost since he was elected. And I think was exacerbated by the Trump election. So the far right that we had here who were pro-Trump of course, saw him as the savior and saw Trudeau as the Antichrist and as the direct antithesis of Trump. He was everything Trump was not. So he was, where Trump was manly, he was considered feminine, feminine or even effeminate, where Trump was, isolationist, he was a globalist. So, all of these sorts of pieces. So in fact, in the study that we're doing now, Institute for Strategic Dialogue in the UK has been doing our online analysis. And they in fact found over the last 2 years, 2019, 2020, that anti-Trudeau sentiment was the most, if not one of the most, if not the most common theme for posting in the far right. So we already had those narratives circulating, and then COVID comes along, and that becomes another sort of magnet or rallying point, excuse me, for populist anxieties, very much like the yellow vesters, right? Concerns about COVID that have been, defined in terms of the lockdowns and the vaccine and the mask and the loss of freedom. So it's really been exploited. That language has really been exploited by the far right, again, to give themselves a place within those protests. I'm not saying that the protests and the protesters are far right. I'm saying that they've been joined by the extreme right, trying to pull them more in that direction.
Right. Has the issue of the burning of the churches been raised at all in the context of what you've been looking at? I mean, the assumption, I think, by most people is that it's been perhaps Indigenous folks who are lashing out at the church. But is it possible that the right-wing extremists are just also involved in this to try to create the kind of friction that might exist, that they might exacerbate by just, again, driving wedges within society? I don't think we have any evidence of that one way or the other yet.
Yeah, there's not much coming out about that, but I mean, my gut feeling is that it actually was Indigenous activity, that because the timing was just too great.
Right.
In terms of, immediately after maybe it was not the first discovery of the bodies, but the second one. And so it very probably was Indigenous in that context. Yeah.
Now, you've already addressed the question to some extent about the sort of the cross-pollinization between these various groups. I'm sure it's very difficult to get any kind of accurate statistics about this. I mean, is there any potential here for double counting? I mean, does John Smith of the Proud Boys also belong to Adamwaff, and it's the same John Smith, or how do you kind of address that problem?
Yeah, that's why we don't even try to put a number on the number of individuals, because there is a lot of that absolutely floating in and out. And there's the other problem is, of course, there's a lot of morphing of groups. So there's infighting, and so they dissolve into two or three different groups. So does that really constitute three new groups, or is it really just more of the same? So it's a real challenge. But we count the groups. If they've got a new identity, we count them as a new group. The challenge is, of course, is sort of that backtracking, and so those we identified 2 years ago in our list, because it's sort of a cumulative list. How many of them are still active? So it's just an absolutely ongoing attempt to, people refer to it as whack-a-mole, right? Because they disappear in one guise and pop up in another guise.
Right. What's your sense about how we ought to be, and I guess the CAF specifically, again, I know this is part of your research program to look at this in terms of how to respond. I mean, on one level, this is simply criminal activity. It's something that the police have been aware of for a very long time. They've been, anybody that engages in this sort of extremist activity, has been on the radar of the police. But, the fact that this is now in the CAF, I mean, should the CAF be simply turning this over to the police to deal with as a quote unquote sort of standard operating criminal activity, or is there something different that the CAF needs to do in order to address these issues?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because the conversations we've had, the concern is that, yeah, I mean, criminal behavior, that's going to be turned over to the MPs or to the, to the civilian criminal justice system, but leadership is also concerned about the hateful conduct, even if it doesn't rise to the level, and engagement in these groups, even if it doesn't rise to the level of criminal behavior, because it is antithetical to the values of the CAF and the values that they're meant to uphold, the Canadian values they're meant to uphold. So leadership sees the membership in these sorts of groups. So I mean, they have prohibited membership in these groups. Again, it's not criminal behavior to engage with these groups, especially if they haven't been listed as terrorist entities. But military is saying there is no space for those kinds of memberships amongst their personnel, because it is a threat to. I think it's a threat to public safety, to be honest, to have people who are meant to be defending us. And I would say the same about police, right? Those who are meant to be defending us, in fact, holding these kinds of attitudes about particular communities or even about the state.
So I think down in the United States a few weeks back, there was an idea floating around that Donald Trump was going to be reinstated as president on some magical date, and then it didn't happen. And then you've mentioned earlier in your presentation that September 21, there could be this other rally in Washington with a bunch of extremist groups and so on. And let's say that whole rally just fizzles out, turns out to be, nothing particularly important. Do you think that these kinds of, for lack of a better term, defeats really affect the mindset and the capabilities of these groups, or is this just a matter of promulgating a view of the world that isn't going to change, sort of regardless of what happens in reality? And how do you start to look at those mindsets from that kind of perspective? It's very complex, obviously.
Yeah, I think that's a really good observation. I think that if it fizzles next week, I think that will be, I think that will be hopefully the beginning of the death knell for the movement, because this is something, I mean, the FBI are really worried about what's going to happen. They're quite convinced things going to happen. So, you've got this level of anxiety, and I think from the perspective of the movement, this level of what expectation and hopefulness, if you will. So I think if it doesn't pan out, that'll be very demoralizing and deflating for members of the movement. And I think, I like to think that it's actually going to quell them rather than further invigorate them. January 6th, I mean, that was a shot in the arm for the movie. Even sure. The Canadian context, we had, sympathy rallies in Canada as well, pro-Trump, stop the steal rallies here as well. So just as that affected us, it's the timing for me that is a little frightening. So if it is, a powerful movement on the 21st, and, that's the day after our election, and if Trudeau should win the election, there's going to be frustration and anger from that side, from the extreme right. Will an American gathering galvanize them as well in that kind of context with that kind of result? So it's going to be a very challenging couple of days next week.
Right. So just to clarify for at least one of our participants, so the work you're going to engage in, your research, being funded by Minds, which is part of the DND, I think it's an ADM Paul program that funds various research activities. So this is something the CAF is obviously very interested in. Mm-hmm. Do you think that they're looking, what level of detail do you think that they're looking for from your project in terms of, allowing them to really take next concrete steps? Or are you going to point them in the general direction of the problem? Or are you going to be providing them with some specific, details that your project is going to uncover?
Well, the hope is that, we're able to quantify to some extent the problem. I think we'll even would just be scratching the surface there, because, I think there will be a lot of fear, both to self-report and to report others as well. Yeah. So, this is always a challenge. Even when we're doing work outside the CAF, it's always a challenge to get people who are involved in the movement to talk. So I think as much as anything, as much as the quantification is sort of the qualification, if you will, is even if we can't count it, can we get a sense of those people who have been drawn to the movement, either as active personnel or as veterans? What were the pressure points, right? What was the motivation? So that helps us to know where to intervene and what kinds of interventions are needed, because I think that's more important than counting it in some respects. Is knowing how to respond to it.
Right. Yeah, and understanding, as you said earlier, about the sort of stage at which someone has become radicalized, whether they were radicalized before joining, or it happened when they were in the CAF, or after they left the CAF, and the ability, each of those phases of somebody's life, there are different drivers involved.
Absolutely.
And that's, so it's a very complex issue.
Yep. And different mechanisms too for, sort of engaging with the movement. So that it calls for different strategies. Does it call for a different kind of screening at entry, that sort of thing?
Right. Right. And so this is another one of those examples of, and it's an extremely important one, of sort of the culture changes that the CAF was looking to make. I remember when I was in basic training out in Chilliwack, sitting, waiting for something to happen, and I won't name names, but a platoon of soldiers goose stepped it down in front of me with the person in charge with his arm raised up in a Nazi salute. That was around 1976, 77.
Yeah.
And, everybody kind of laughed. But, there you are. That's how many years ago.
Yeah.
And it was seen as a joke, but I'm not sure how much of a joke it actually was.
Yeah.
But this is not something that's new in that sense.
That's true. Yeah. It's interesting. The PDF, Phil McChrystal, who's working with us, his PhD dissertation was on sexual violence against women in the military. And so that whole idea of culture change has been very much a part of his work, and so carries into here. I mean, it's, it's very much interconnected. You can't separate gender-based violence from, the race-based violence or, anti-gay violence that we might see from members of the movement.
Right. I mean, the CAF is drawn from society in general, and it's part of society in general, and it lives in society in general.
Yeah.
So, unfortunately, it's not immune to the issues that are occurring within society in general.
Yeah.
And but as you said,
like
earlier,
we often say about law enforcement, right? We hold them to a different standard.
To a higher standard. To a higher standard. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. Well, listen, Barbara, I don't see any other questions coming across the screen at this moment, and I think that
someone had asked is the chat available to everyone? Because someone
I think so.
To put my email up again.
Something I've missed.
So I'm just going to put my email in there.
Yes, he's my student, so he wants to talk to you. I was going to give him to that offline, but anyways, please go ahead.
That's okay. No, I'll put it up here for anyone who wants to contact me for any reason. If you want to volunteer to participate in our research, when we finally get our research ethics board approval.
All right. That'd be great. Thank you so much. I'm sure Joseph would appreciate that. He's learning on the fly here, but yeah, that's wonderful.
Good.
So Barbara, thank you very much for taking the time.
It was great. I enjoyed it. I thank you everyone for the questions. That's always a good sign when there are questions, and some really, really thoughtful and thought-provoking questions as well. So thank you.
Well, thank you. As I normally do, please allow me just to take a couple of seconds to talk about what's coming up next, because in fact, next Thursday, a week from today, on the 23rd of September, we have Phil Gursky with his book launch, which is entitled The Peaceable Kingdom, A History of Terrorism in Canada. And he has a complete section on right-wing extremism. So this is going to be a bit of a follow-on for us. And so we're looking forward to that. So we've got two great speakers in September. We have another speaker on the 20th of October, again at 7 o'clock in the evening. Dr. Richard Shamuka is going to talk about Canadian-U.S. military relations in the post-Trump era. And given interesting things that have been going on in the U.S. military in the last few days and things that have been going in Canada in the last several months, that ought to be pretty interesting, to say the least. And then we're really fortunate that I've convinced Major General Dennis Thompson to speak to us in November about his recent experience in trying to get Afghans out of Afghanistan that supported the mission. And he's going to be talking to us along with Major General David Fraser and Major General Dean Milner. And the three of those folks have been working very hard on that issue, and I think they're going to share some interesting stories with us in November. I don't have a specific date yet because they're actually still busy actively working on this problem as we speak. But I think by November they'll be able to raise their heads up a bit and share some of this information with us. So we've got some very interesting things coming forward for us in the next couple of months. Right, I think with that, unless there's any other critical questions coming forth, you have Barbara's email. I'm sure she'd be happy to answer your questions once we conclude our session tonight. So Barbara, I'm looking forward to seeing you at the RCMI Live as soon as we can make that happen. I'd like to thank you for taking the time tonight. I'd like to thank everybody who's online with us tonight. It's great to see so many people involved. And as you know, these sessions are videotaped. They'll be posted shortly to our YouTube site. Let me thank, as always, Sylvia Lau, who is the center of gravity of the RCMI at the moment. She keeps everything running. Eric Moritz is one of my colleagues there in charge of communications. Nothing would happen without him as well. So this is all great. So on behalf of the Royal Canadian Military Institute, our members, and Dr. Michael Hoare, the president, Barbara, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us this evening. I look forward to seeing you again, and thank you to everyone else. Have a pleasant evening, and I hope to see you at the Long Bar with a beer in hand shortly. Good night, and thank you.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.